New Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo DS is the first game I have memories of playing. That might seem like a cliche I made up for dramatic effect. Like, what are the odds the first game the guy who makes videos about 2D Mario ever played was a 2D Mario game? But no, seriously, the earliest memories I have of anything gaming related are of me getting stuck in the second half of World 1 of New Super Mario Bros., dying and going game over again and again, until one day some friends came over and beat the World 1 castle for me and unlocked World 2. Before then, I didn't even know the game had multiple worlds. Then over the next few years, as I got better and better at not repeatedly dying in the game, I became obsessed with it, and by the time the shiny home console sequel came out, I'd beaten the original DS New Super Mario Bros. Countless times. Thus, my obsession moved over to New Super Mario Bros. Wii, which led to my interest in the game's modding community, which evolved into New Super Mario Bros. U, and then Super Mario Bros. Wonder modding. And here we are, 20 years later. Because yes, that's how long it's been. Although I know for sure that I didn't get it at launch myself, today marks the 20-year anniversary of New Super Mario Bros. And I thought to celebrate the occasion and reckon with my own complicated feelings towards the game, this would be as good a time as any for me to replay New Super Mario Bros. And see how it's aged and how it fits into the evolving legacy of 2D Mario as a whole. The reason I'd say I have complicated feelings about the game today is that, despite my undeniable nostalgia for it, with the benefit of hindsight, and for a variety of reasons I'll get into throughout this video, my opinion on the original New Super Mario Bros. Has kinda soured over the past 2 decades. So, how does the game hold up today? Well, let's find out. Oh, by the way, I should mention that I'm only going to be covering the game's main campaign, not Mario vs Luigi or the minigames, because those don't fall under the type of traditional 2D platformer design that I know a lot about and have a lot of opinions on. I think a logical place to start when it comes to discussing New Super Mario Bros. Is by setting the scene surrounding the game's development and release. Presumably, a large part of the reason why the game has this annoying adjective in its title is that it indicates that it served as a sort of revival of the Super Mario Bros. Series as a whole. Given before New Super Mario Bros., Nintendo hadn't released an original 2D Mario platformer since Super Mario Land 2 more than a decade earlier. In general, 2D platformers were few and far between throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, since at the time the novelty of 3D graphics and gameplay presumably meant both consumers and developers didn't really see the point of continuing to play or make games that featured seemingly outdated side-scrolling gameplay. Thus, home console Mario games became 3D collectathons, and on the handheld side of the market, the Game Boy Advance only received ports of older Mario side-scrollers in the form of the Super Mario Advance series. Then the DS launched along with another mainline Mario port, this time one of Super Mario 64, to show off its 3D capabilities. And it seems like, alongside the breakthrough of handheld 3D graphics, the feeling that making original 2D side-scrollers wouldn't be appealing or worthwhile started to wear off, since it was by essentially combining the mechanics of the recent 2D and 3D Mario remakes that New Super Mario Bros. Was made. And I think this contrast between the game's split origins as both a revival of classic 2D Mario mechanics and gameplay and a showcase of modernized 3D Mario graphics and gimmicks informs a lot of my conflicting feelings about the game's design, particularly when it comes to its presentation. New Super Mario Bros. Features a mixture of fully 2D sprite and tile-based assets with limited resolutions and color palettes and everything you'd expect from classic pixel art games basically, and 3D modeled characters and gimmicks with polygons and skeletal animations and stuff like that. I assume the decision to partially rely on simple 3D assets led to the game feeling quite impressive and modern looking at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think New Super Mario Bros. Is often a very ugly looking game. It's hard for me to ignore the way many of the presumably pre-rendered or even hand-drawn 2D assets feel like they're from a completely different game, a completely different era of games even, than the chunky 3D models that are used right alongside them. Perhaps the worst offender is Mario himself, and the way he looks like a wriggling mess of pixels most of the time. Almost all of the classic 2D Mario sprites look more appealing than this, in my opinion. And in fact, there's no better way of demonstrating the awkwardness of the mixture of 2D and 3D elements that this game is littered with than by making him hold a shell, which is a 2D sprite and looks incredibly strange floating around Mario's 3D hands. Though, to be fair, the use of a 3D modeled main character with smooth skeletal animations does add to the feel of the game's fluid movement and controls in a way that a 2D sprite could have never done. But regardless, I don't think it's controversial to say that a fully 2D, perhaps even pixel art inspired visual style would have made the game age much more gracefully. I'm not a huge fan of Super Princess Peach, but even its not that amazing looking 2D art style still makes it much more visually appealing in this day and age than its mainline younger brother. And that's not to mention more obvious examples like Yoshi's Island, or Yoshi's Island DS for that matter. New Super Mario Bros. Was clearly made to be a system seller, and one of the many showcases of the DS's 3D rendering capabilities, but this decision has ended up coming back to bite the game in the long run, in my opinion. This same confused stylistic identity is also apparent in the game's music and sound effects, by the way. New Super Mario Bros. Features a strange blend of classic-sounding chirps and bleeps, and more realistic recordings that tend to be very compressed, like Mario's voice lines. The composition of the game's music itself is pretty great, I think, even though it is a bit jarring how most of the more unique level environments just recycle the overworld and athletic themes again and again, but in terms of quality and especially consistency, yeah, I don't think the game's presentation has held up well at all really. Okay, but what about the gameplay? Again, I think a good way of approaching this topic is by highlighting the contrast of how, yes, New Super Mario Bros. Features a lot of ideas taken from Super Mario 64 DS, but at the same time it is obviously a direct successor to the classic 2D Mario games. Something that I kinda forgot before replaying the game is that its title makes sense in more ways than one. Not only is it literally a new Super Mario Bros. Game, but it is also basically a retread of specifically Super Mario Bros. For the NES, with a lot of new elements sprinkled on top. Whereas, for example, more recently, Super Mario Bros. Wonder clearly aimed to avoid a lot of the 2D Mario tropes which were set up by the NES original, New Super Mario Bros. Feels very purposefully conventional. This is clear in the game's structure, with the consistent spread of overworld, underground, athletic, and underwater levels almost perfectly matching the level pattern seen in SMB 1. I assume it's because of this adherence to a cycle of tropey level environments that World 6, for example, is mostly made up of levels that barely even fit its mountainous theming. And the makeup of individual levels also generally feels very classic, with most overworld levels featuring long stretches of trivial terrain that focus on enemy encounters more than platforming challenges, underground levels being partially made up of kinda unintuitive brick block formations, almost every single athletic level revolving around mushrooms and simple moving platforms, and underwater levels generally being straight corridors filled with cheap cheeps and other types of aquatic obstacles. And although this can feel a bit unimaginative and repetitive at times, I think the choice to keep the game's level design so formulaic makes a lot of sense when you remember that New Super Mario Bros. Aimed to reintroduce the concept of classic Super Mario Bros. Design as a whole to a new generation. However, replaying the game today, that argument doesn't hold as much water. I did get pretty bored when I got to the 5th slow underwater level, or what felt like the 20th athletic level spammed with various types of mushrooms that I'd all encountered before. This same complaint also applies to the game's tower and castle levels, most of which make use of moving blocks that can crush you again and again. I think the extent to which the designers managed to recontextualize this one gimmick throughout so many different levels is commendable, but obviously focusing on more unique individual ideas for each fortress would have been my preference. The game almost gets away with reusing a relatively small pool of mechanics so many times across an expansive campaign, but a lot of ideas do start to wear thin by the end. But that's only accounting for the chunk of the game's content that is either mostly based on classic 2D Mario elements or completely original. As I've already mentioned multiple times, many of New Super Mario Bros.'s ideas were taken directly from Super Mario 64 DS of all games. Presumably, it's thanks to this controversial remake that the game not only features Mario's modernized moveset, but also Unagi, Womps, Amps, Sushi, Scuttlebugs, Cheep Chomps, Skeeters, Tornadoes, Dories, and maybe even the big Goomba boss fight. Even though I played both games as a kid, I don't think I ever picked up on just how blatant and occasionally awkward the choice to implement so many of 64DS's gimmicks into a completely different type of game is. Maybe it's just because they rarely showed up in side-scrollers past this point, but mechanics like Womps don't really work well in 2D at all in my opinion. Their 3D attacks and collision applied to a 2D space aren't intuitive whatsoever. And that's just one example of the type of jankiness that honestly it feels like the game is filled with. A lot of New Super Mario Bros.'s level design feels, I guess, charmingly outdated in a way. Today we tend to think of it as the start of a series that would go on to basically define an era of Mario design and theming, but replaying the game I was surprised by just how clear it is that the developers hadn't quite figured out that soon-to-be seminal design formula yet. What I mean is that modern 2D Mario levels, both in the New Super Mario Bros. Games and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, follow certain unwritten rules that lead to that Nintendo-y feeling of quality and intuitiveness. The way terrain is shaped, the way blocks are placed, how gimmicks and enemies are spread across a level, the even distribution of power-ups, how collectibles are hidden, how ideas are set up and paid off. There's a design language that's existed for these aspects of 2D Mario level structure since the NES, but which has evolved over the decades, and I feel like was only truly set in stone around New Super Mario Bros. Wii. All that's to say that the DS New Super Mario Bros. Features level design that is quirky in a way that reminded me of games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and World almost as much as modern 2D Mario games. A lot of levels feel like strange mazes of sub-areas and puzzles and secrets within secrets. Sometimes half a level won't have any power-ups, sometimes a checkpoint appears right at the start of a level, other times 3/4 of the way through. Levels will set up one gimmick and then drop it and play with some different ideas instead for no apparent reason, and there are multiple levels that feature gigantic blobs of terrain that form slopes and jumps and drops in ways that would never fly in modern 2D Mario games. Now, I have problems with all of these decisions, perhaps partially because I am more in tune with the specific formula of truly modern 2D Mario design than most people, which made my recent playthrough occasionally frustrating and confusing, but like I said earlier, it is also undeniably charming in a way to play a game that isn't quite tied to the type of level design I'd expect from Nintendo these days. Although it sometimes led to frustration, it was also often kinda fun to be caught off guard by the way New Super Mario Bros.'s level design diverges from the formula I'm so used to in the modern 2D Mario games. However, the one aspect of the game's level design where its uniqueness is consistently more annoying than intriguing in my opinion is the way the game handles collectibles and secrets. It's easy to forget these days, but before New Super Mario Bros. Introduced Star Coins, 2D Mario levels never really featured important collectibles that were kept track of outside of the levels. Sure, Super Mario World has Dragon Coins, but although those probably directly inspired Star Coins, their implementation isn't really all that similar beyond the broad strokes. And so, because there was no precedent for how major collectibles should be integrated into 2D Mario levels before New Super Mario Bros., compared to, again, the formulaic way secrets are spread across modern Mario levels, Star Coins in New Super Mario Bros. Are unique. Like, for example, something that really threw me off replaying the game is just how often all 3 of a level's star coins are placed after its checkpoint flag, something which is rarely the case in the modern games. I guess the developers decided to keep the focus during the first half of some levels on introducing its gimmicks rather than hiding collectibles. But more importantly, I can count the amount of memorable bonus rooms that feature star coins and make interesting use of a level's mechanics on one hand. Instead, I'd say maybe half of the game's star coins are just sort of randomly placed up in the air or against a wall somewhere. Because both ground pounding and especially wall jumping were new at this point, it seems like the level designers often felt that just requiring the player to do one of those is enough to reward them. That in and of itself isn't really such a terrible thing. If all of the game's collectibles were trivial to get, that would be disappointing but not annoying. But another major chunk of the game's star coins, not to mention secret exits, are hidden in the most cryptic and frustrating ways possible. I'm talking about hidden vine blocks, unmarked enterable pipes, and worst of all, random mini Mario pipes. Whereas later entries in the New Super Mario Bros. Series pretty much gave up on the idea of trying to make the mini mushroom useful in more than a handful of levels, during the creation of the DS game, it seems like the developers still had hope that some players might actually want to use the new power-up. So not only do loads of levels feature mini Mario only bonus rooms and shortcuts that aren't necessary for 100%ing the game, but there are also 10 or so star coins that require you to get a mini mushroom from somewhere else and then precariously take it back through the level just to get a single collectible. As someone who already doesn't usually like it when secrets are locked behind power-ups that a level actually contains, this design choice is maybe my least favorite thing in the entire game. There is nothing fun about casually playing a level, finding star coins 1 and 2, and then seeing a mini pipe and realizing you'll have to spend the next 10 minutes looking for a mini mushroom in some other level, and then bringing it back here hoping you don't die in the process. It just feels like padding. It's weird because the game features loads of toad houses that give you a mega mushroom, but not a mini mushroom equivalent, even though there's only a single star coin in the entire game that requires you to take a mega mushroom into a level. So talking about the integration of power-ups as a whole, the mega mushroom is mostly pointless, the mini mushroom's usage feels forced, and I know some people swear by the blue shell, but I simply don't like using it. I think with the benefit of hindsight, it's safe to say that, in general, the experiment of making a game focused on gimmicky power-ups that mostly aren't actually integrated into normal levels was a failure, considering not a single mainline Mario game has been designed in this way ever since. Replaying New Super Mario Bros. Nearly 2 decades after it laid the groundwork for my love of 2D platformers was a strange experience. There is something bizarre about playing a game that features 1,000 slightly weird and outdated design decisions that all sort of threw me for a loop, and yet at the same time none of those quirks ever truly surprised me because I grew up with this game. I've seen all of this stuff before, even if I didn't fully remember it. New Super Mario Bros. Features an odd blend of classical and what would become modern 2D Mario design, with a heap of Super Mario 64 DS inspiration dumped on top, to make for a game that is, I suppose, truly one of a kind. As much as people rightfully complain about the monotony of the New Super Mario Bros. Series of games that this first entry ended up inspiring, that doesn't make this game any worse in my opinion. However, as I've talked about in some of my previous videos, I personally tend to prefer games that feature tighter and more polished design, even if they achieved this by mostly iterating on a previous entry in the series. So although I can see how the uniqueness of New Super Mario Bros., not to mention nostalgia, has probably led some people to seeing it as a game that stands above its many sequels, its one-of-a-kind nature isn't enough to make me overlook its flaws. I still think the game is fundamentally frustrating in a way that none of its sequels replicate. So 20 years later, yes, New Super Mario Bros. Has aged quite a bit, I think. Though of course, that doesn't change the fact that I am nothing but grateful for the way it led me to where I am today. And that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Sorry for not really delving into the specifics of the game that much, although I would have loved to spend like an hour talking about noteworthy parts of certain levels, not to mention things like the game's boss fights. As I was putting this video together, I decided I'd rather focus on my broader opinions on the game's design as a whole. If you have anything to share regarding your experiences with or feelings about New Super Mario Bros., be sure to do so by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like, subscribing, checking out my Discord server linked in the description, or signing up for a YouTube channel membership to support the channel and to get early access to upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!